May I begin with just a few thank yous and notices. Firstly, may I thank the sponsors of this webinar, who include Churches Together in England, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, and the Samuel Gurney Foundation. And we're also very grateful to the United Reformed Church, the body which is running this IT provision for this seminar. I'd also like to thank our IT host, Olabanka, who is behind the scenes and keeping us all in order. She's a research student at New College in Edinburgh, engaging in a master's degree anyway. As I mentioned, the webinar is being recorded and will be available shortly. Each of our speakers will be speaking for about 15 minutes each, and it will then be followed by a Q&A session. Could I invite you to use the chat function to put your questions? And you may like to just put them in as the evening progresses, so that when something strikes you from one or other of the speakers, it's not then lost in the ongoing progress of the evening. We have, as you know, 4 significant speakers in the order in which they're presenting. They are Gethin Rees, who was born in Cardiff, educated at Oxford, where he studied PPE, philosophy, politics and economics, and then was awarded an MPhil in politics, and subsequently went on to graduate in theology at Birmingham. He's the policy officer for Churches Together in Wales, and speaking to us tonight from Belfast. Our second speaker is Laura Dunlop, QC, who is president of the Mental Health Tribunal for Scotland and is the procurator to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. Our third speaker is Malcolm Brown. Malcolm is the Director of Mission and Public Affairs for the Archbishop's Council of the Church of England, written much in terms of church and economic life and relations in that area, but after the market and so on. And he's also currently a visiting professor of religion and theology at the University of Winchester. Last but certainly not least is Johnny Clark. Johnny is the director of Youth with a Mission in Ireland. He's speaking to us this evening from Belfast as well. He is one who, for in excess of 2 decades, has been working on the intersection of Christian mission and Christian peace building in Northern Ireland, of course, and in several other post-conflict countries around the world. Deeply committed to seeing reconciliation placed at the heart of the church's mission and teaching on discipleship. Before we turn to our first speaker, namely Gethin, may I just lead you all in prayer? O God, the maker of all things, we give thee thanks for all who have served thee with fruitful labour, for the increase of knowledge and wisdom, and for the nurture of faithful servants of thy church and kingdom. As thou didst enable them to add their share to thy work, wrought out by many hands from age to age, so teach us and strengthen us, we pray, to do thy will in the task which thou hast apportioned us in this our generation. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee and the Holy Spirit, one God, world without end. Amen. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome as our first speaker, Gethin. Gethin, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation tonight. And as I say, it so happens I'm in Belfast, but I'm talking about Wales. Church and state in Wales over, and the slides are not moving forward. Right. Right, there we are. I'm going to forbear 1,000 years of church and state in Wales and begin with the dawn of devolution, which, as you may know, was 1215 in the Magna Carta, when clauses 56 and 57 guaranteed that the people of Wales should be judged by the laws of Wales, provided they maintained allegiance to the English crown. So devolution is not a new concept. It dates back at least to Magna Carta. And that phase of devolution lasted 300 years until Henry VIII, who in 1535 and 1542 instituted the Laws in Wales Acts, which basically, to simplify slightly, made the laws in Wales the same as the laws in England. In other words, abolished devolution. They're often called Acts of Union, but they weren't. They were acts, of course, of conquest rather than of union. There was no Welsh Parliament to consent, as there was in Scotland in 1707 or in Ireland in 1801. They also included a clause saying that only, right at the bottom of the slide, only the English speech or language might be used in Wales in official business. It didn't actually ban people speaking the language to each other, but it banned it in official and state business. But church and state from now on intertwined, because that ban didn't last very long, thanks to the Protestant Reformation. In 1567, the Book of Common Prayer and the New Testament had to be translated by the state church into Welsh, because, of course, a service entirely in English was as meaningless as a service entirely in Latin to the average Welsh person, and the Reformation was failing for that reason. And in 1588, the Bible as a whole was translated. And so church and state became intimately intertwined for the following centuries. It was the state, through the church, which saved the Welsh language, unlike, for example, the Cornish language, into which the Bible was not translated at the time. And that intertwining is seen in the subsequent centuries. Oliver Cromwell introduced the first piece of specifically Welsh legislation into Westminster, the Propagation of the Gospel in Wales Act, and the very title tells you that it was about church and state, because the Welsh were still insufficiently Protestant, despite having the Welsh language Bible, and Oliver Cromwell needed to do more to ensure that the gospel could be propagated. Now, that act, of course, didn't last, obviously, beyond the Restoration in 1660. It was repealed by Charles II. But then in the 19th century, church, in the form of nonconformist churches, began to influence legislation in Wales very considerably. The Sunday Closing Wales Act was an outcome of the temperance movement requiring pubs to close in Wales on Sundays, subject to a local referendum. But initially, those referendums across Wales required the pubs to close. The Wales Intermediate Education, I think that should be the Welsh Intermediate Education Act, 1889, which was partly to do with the role of the church in intermediate education. And as a consequence, secondary education became compulsory in Wales 3 years before it became compulsory in England. The Welsh Cemeteries Act of 1908, giving nonconformist clergy the right to use nonconformist forms of service when burying in the parish churchyard, which tended to be the only graveyard available in much of Wales, and instituted a form which a nonconformist cleric can still serve upon recalcitrant Anglican clergy who may attempt to prevent such burials from taking place. And you may smile, but I actually had to do that once during my ministry when a Church in Wales cleric would not permit that to happen without the appropriate notice being served. So I'm very grateful for the Welsh Cemeteries Act 1908. Lloyd George, a prime mover in that, as he was in the Welsh Church Act 1914, which led, of course, this First World War intervened, led to the disestablishment of the Church in Wales in 1920. Were it not for COVID, there would have been big celebrations of that, of course, last year. 100 years for our disestablishment, 150 years for Irish disestablishment in the same year. I'm not going to talk any more about that, although it does relate to church and state, because you can all buy Norman Doe's book, details on screen. As the 20th century moved on, Westminster had to pass more Welsh legislation, the Welsh Courts Act, the Welsh Language Act, two Welsh Language Acts. The Welsh Courts Act also had a church and state aspect. Why did people want to use the Welsh language in court? Well, because in 1942, because they were nonconformist pacifists who wished to argue their conscientious objection in their own language. So that too, in its way, was about church and state. And Welsh language churches were very much involved in the two Welsh Language Acts and the agitation which led to them as well. In 1979, there was a referendum whether there should be devolution to revert to Magna Carta, to allow Welsh people to be governed by the laws of Wales. The Welsh people voted overwhelmingly no. The leaflet on the right proved to be far more persuasive, 4 times as persuasive as the leaflet on the left. But that was not the end of the story. In the early 1990s, John Major appointed John Redwood as Secretary of State for Wales. He has just published his diaries. They're very interesting, actually. The title of the diaries, which covers his period as Secretary of State, is Speaking for England. And that may give you a clue as to why he was the least popular Secretary of State for Wales in history. He did indeed speak for England from his vantage point as Secretary of State for Wales. He also went to a housing estate in St Mellons in East Cardiff, where there is a very successful ecumenical church sponsored by the Covenanted Churches in Wales. Be of interest to the Society for Ecumenical Studies. And he said the problem with this estate is there are far too many unmarried mothers who are having babies. And this is the reason for social deprivation on this estate. It scandalised the local church, it scandalised many other people, including the churches nationally, who managed to meet after some difficulty with Mr. Redwood, who spent all the meeting looking out of the window and not listening. But nonetheless, the churches went ahead and published this report, Wales, a Model Society, by, as we were called then, Cytun, Churches Together in Wales, which began by discussing family life and the issues that John Redwood had raised, but went on to talk also about other moral issues in society. What is it that makes a country a model society? It had considerable influence. I don't think we would claim that it was the sole influence behind what happened next, but it certainly had some influence. In 1997, there was a further referendum on devolution. Welsh-speaking West Wales and the valleys, English-speaking mainly valleys, areas dominated by non-conformity, so linking with some of the earlier issues I've already referred to, voted yes. The areas in red on the map voted no. Yes won by just over 6,000 votes across the whole of Wales, but 6,000 is enough. The first elections to the Assembly were held in May 1999. And unusually, perhaps, for the churches were ahead of the game. The man on the right there, Aled Edwards, who's now Chief Executive of Cytun, was appointed as National Assembly Liaison Officer and was in place before the first Assembly members were elected. So the church was there before the Parliament, and was an important presence, particularly in the first year of the Assembly, when it could all have collapsed. I'm currently in Belfast, where it could be that the Assembly in Belfast is going to collapse again in coming days. I very much hope not. Well, that could have happened in Wales too in 1999-2000. And Aled played a very important behind-the-scenes role in making sure that it didn't. He's pictured there with the second First Minister of Wales, Rhodri Morgan, Uzo Iwobi, who's a black Christian from Race Council Cymru, and Jane Hutt, who is the longest-serving government minister anywhere in the British Isles. She is currently Minister for Social Justice in the new Welsh government. Initially, the legislative powers of the Assembly were limited, but one of the things that they were able to do in 2011 was finally to repeal that clause from 1535, prohibiting the use of the Welsh language or requiring the use of the English language in public service. Only in 2011 did Welsh become accepted as an official language in Wales. And in the same year, in 2011, there was a further referendum to give that assembly full lawmaking powers. This time, the vote was overwhelming, a two-thirds majority. Every county in Wales voted yes, apart from Monmouthshire, and the vote in Monmouthshire was 49.9%. So it really was a pretty overwhelming yes vote, allowing the Assembly to make laws in all the areas that Wales and Moral Society had discussed and which are now devolved to Wales. And that phase of devolution lasted not 300 years like Magna Carta, but 9 years, because the UK Internal Market Act passed last year has in fact removed a considerable amount of that lawmaking power. We're not quite sure how much yet, but it has removed quite a bit of it from Wales, and we will see that'll be a big source of conflict in the coming years. But one of the acts that has been passed, of which the churches are very proud, Christian Aid played a very formative role in the civil society engagement with Welsh Government that led to this act. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act, which made Wales the first country in the world to embody the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a foundational principle of all future legislation. And on Tuesday this week, that's yesterday, the Welsh Government published its programme for government for the next 5 years, and with it, as it's statutorily obliged to do, it published a well-being analysis of how this legislation would contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals in Wales. Meanwhile, church and state interact, of course, in multitudinous ways. So on screen now, the first presiding officer of the Assembly was very keen that it was a secular parliament, and secular to him meant no religious activity on the premises. Subsequent presiding officers have taken a different term, a different view of the word secular, the view that I would take, that it means everyone is welcome equally. And so the British Humanist Association has held events on the estate, but so, as you can see, has the Muslim Council for Wales, with the second presiding officer, Rosemary Butler, taking part. On the steps of the Senedd has become the place for protests, but also for vigils. There is Carwyn Jones, the third First Minister of Wales, addressing a joint vigil organised by the Interfaith Council for Wales with Catene, with the Muslim Council for Wales, after one of the many, sadly, terrorist attacks of recent years, and showing the value of the Faith Communities Forum, which was established following the 9/11 2001 attacks in Wales. And also on the Assembly State, the Evangelical Alliance organised a wonderful celebration of all the different ethnic forms of Christianity which are currently in Wales. There in the top you can see the Ethiopian and Eritrean Christians worshipping together. And that's no mean thing, because Ethiopians and Eritreans who live in Wales are in nearly all cases refugees from the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. But in Wales, they were able in the Parliament to worship together at a very, very joyous occasion. There's also an annual carol service. It had to be called a carol concert in the first years in order to be sufficiently secular. It's now known as what it always has been, a carol service. And on the top right, you can see Darren Miller, who's a member of the Senedd, along on the left with David Emery, who is a Salvation Army officer. You know, he's not in uniform, but he is the chaplain to the Senedd. It has taken 20 years to get a chaplaincy service established within the Senedd itself, rather than members of the Senedd having to go out to a church or meet a minister outside. And David does a very important role on behalf of all of us, but we're immensely grateful to the Salvation Army who have funded this post and who have provided a new link between church and state in Wales as our relationship continues to develop, as it has ever since 1215. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. A very enjoyable and helpful presentation. May we now turn to our second speaker, Laura Dunlop.
Thank you, and Thank you very much for the invitation to speak tonight, and thank you, Gethin. I've jotted down some thoughts already and might even manage to weave one of them into what I'm going to say. I've entitled my remarks Presbyterianism from Patronage to Percy. In 2001, I was appearing in a case in the Court of Session with no connection to ecclesiastical matters. In fact, it was about vodka and whiskey, rather far from the Holy Spirit. My opponent referenced a 19th century case, but had momentarily misplaced its citation. Around 1870, he said, hopefully. One of the judges, Lord Roger of Earlsferry, an expert on church history, exclaimed, "Mr. Jones, it's a disruption case." For those unable to translate this coded exchange, the disruption refers to the walkout of a large proportion of the delegates from the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in 1843. In what was obviously a carefully choreographed move, they marched to Tanfield Hall in Cannon Mills on the north side of Edinburgh, where many more ministers and elders were waiting. Thus was the Free Church born. And all going well, I should be able to show you a slide at this point. Has that worked? Got that slide, I hope. This is
not as yet.
No. Right. Let me not be doing this the right.
Here we are. Yes, we have it now. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. This is a painting by David Octavius Hill. He was present at the Disruption Assembly in 1843. And he was with his friend Robert Adamson, who was using a new technology, photography. Hill and Adamson took a series of photographs of those who had been present and of the setting. And this painting, which is Hill's painting, was eventually completed, I think, from the photographs in 1866. What had led to this secession, and are the factors relevant today? To answer that, we must travel further back in time. And in so doing, I want to acknowledge the support I've had in looking at other material. And I'm not sure how well this is going to work in terms of the next slide. Yes, there we go. I hope that's worked all right. Alvin, can you reassure me that you can see my sort of bibliography?
Yes, we can.
Good, thank you. So I have drawn in my remarks on two books, Francis Lyle of Presbyters and Kings and Lord Roger of Earlsferry, the same Lord Roger I mentioned a moment ago, the Courts, the Church and the Constitution, and also on a very important article about the disruption by Harold Lasky as long ago as 1916. Part one then is patronage, and a reasonable place to start is around the time of the Union of Scotland and England in 1707. That year, the Scottish Parliament passed the Protestant Religion and Presbyterian Church Act, providing that Presbyterian church government and discipline was to remain and continue unalterable in Scotland. This was with an eye to the Treaty of Union with England, approval of which by the Parliament of Scotland expressly mentioned observation of the terms of the Presbyterian Church, etc. Act as a fundamental and essential condition of the Treaty of Union. Yet in 1711, so only 4 years later, the UK Parliament passed the Church Patronage Scotland Act, reintroducing a system of patronage which had been abolished in Scotland in 1690. The effect was to create patronage, a right in the Crown or a local landowner to nominate a man licensed by the church as a preacher to be the new minister in a parish. Local presbytery was obliged to accept this nomination, irrespective of the wishes of the congregation concerned. Formal protest against the Patronage Act was made at the General Assembly every year until 1784. After some respite from protest when the church was dominated by the moderates, the early years of the 19th century saw a further rise in the evangelical wing of the Church of Scotland and increasing opposition again to the institution of patronage, especially after the passage of the 1832 Reform Act in relation to the parliamentary franchise. But what form should opposition to patronage take? Should it be abolished or regulated? In the absence of any parliamentary proposals for abolition, the Church decided to pass its own legislation, stipulating for the right of a congregation, more specifically a majority of male communicant heads of families, to object to the choice of a minister by the patron. In 1834, the General Assembly passed an interim act creating this veto, which became final in 1835, the Veto Act. Meanwhile, in Auchterarder in Perthshire, a Mr. Young had been nominated as minister by the Earl of Kinnoul, the patron, but 287 of a possible 330 male heads of families recorded their dissent from that call. In October 1835, a case was raised in the Court of Session on behalf of Mr. Young and the Earl, objecting to the decision of the Presbytery of Auchterarder to refuse to call Mr. Young. A hearing took place in the Court of Session over 10 days in December 1837, and it's not difficult to anticipate the territory on which battle was joined. The objections to Mr. Young were based on the Church's Veto Act, but his rights and those of the patron, the Earl, were based on an Act of Parliament. Should the identity of the parish minister be determined according to provisions of secular law, or was it a spiritual matter, jurisdiction over which belonged and only belonged to the Church? And who had the right to determine if this was a civil or spiritual matter? It took 6 days alone to deliver the judgments. By a majority of 8 to 5, the judges found for Mr. Young and the Earl. There were 2 principal bases to their judgment. Firstly, the subject matter was not exclusively spiritual, they said, since patrimonial rights were involved. Secondly, the church courts, including the General Assembly, could not contradict the provisions of an Act of Parliament. An appeal was taken to the House of Lords by the Presbytery, but was wholly unsuccessful, judgment being issued at the beginning of May 1839. At the same time, and over the ensuing few years, there were other skirmishes and differing positions regarding tactics. Should the General Assembly repeal the Veto Act? Was there a way of decoupling the civil rights of a minister and patron from the purely spiritual question of induction by the Presbytery? Would the government and/or Parliament indicate sympathy for the position of the non-intrusionists, as they were known, and look to reform the Patronage Act? Suffice to say that no solution was found to what was a hugely significant crisis for the Church and for Scotland. As Lord Coburn, a non-intrusionist, observed, the majority of the judges had not said what Christ would have done if faced with an order from a civil court about the identity of his apostles. So a convocation of ministers met in Edinburgh in November 1842. Resolutions were published, although the deliberations were kept secret. In January 1843, Peel's government in London rejected the Church's representations. Further reverses for the Church occurred in the civil courts, and this is the background to the disruption. Most of the ministers who had attended the convocation, and others too, left the Church of Scotland. In setting up the new church, they and their followers left the security of the established church, one of the finest acts of principle that had been seen, according to Lord Coburn. Part 2 I've called After the Disruption. Skipping through many decades here, but in Scotland the Church had years of difficulty and further schisms. Time doesn't permit exploration of the subsequent genesis of the Free Presbyterian Church or the United Free. Let's fast forward to the 1920s, and I'm going to read a short paragraph from Francis Lyall's book. He comments that in all the proceedings of the period 1843 to 1929, although there is a move towards the granting of greater freedom of action to the Church, that grant was always made by the intervention of the state. Patronage was abolished, that was in 1874, but by the state, and the civil courts continue to have an important role in disputes under the Act. New parishes were more easily to be established and their ministers were given full status, but only under statute. Even the requirements of the church as to doctrinal profession of ministers was a matter in which the state had the last say. Although power was granted to the assembly, what Caesar gives, Caesar may take away. The established church was therefore gaining freedom, but freedom, as it were, on a lead. Such powers as it had were given to it by the state and were not inherent in it, ex natura. Early in the 20th century, thoughts turned to union, especially after the formation of the United Free Church in Scotland in 1900. It was obvious that the Church of Scotland, which had survived a campaign for its disestablishment at the end of the 19th century, would wish to retain established status. It was equally obvious that the United Free Church, having come in part from the church formed at the time of the disruption, would be intolerant of state intervention in matters spiritual. My predecessor as procurator, Christopher Johnston, later Lord Sandys, prepared a memorandum in 1912 proposing that the Church of Scotland seek a reformulation of its constitution to be approved by the state. Negotiations between the two churches followed, and the result was a set of articles declaratory, which are contained in the schedule to the Church of Scotland Act 1921, and obviously we're in its centenary year. For our purposes, the most important of the articles declaratory are Article 4, and I'm hoping that's come up, Article 4, where I have highlighted the key words that the Church receives from Christ and from him alone right and power subject to no civil authority to legislate and to adjudicate finally in all matters of doctrine, worship, government and discipline in the Church, including the right to determine all questions concerning membership and office in the Church. And you'll hear the echoes of Mr. Young and the Earl of Kinnoul in that. And that recognition, reading short, does not in any way affect the character of this government and jurisdiction as derived from the divine head of the Church alone, or give to the civil authority any right of interference with the proceedings or judgment of the Church within the sphere of its spiritual government and jurisdiction. And Article 6, the Church and the state owe mutual duties to each other, and acting within their respective spheres may signally promote each other's welfare, and crucially have the right each to determine all questions concerning the extent and the continuance of their mutual relations in the discharge of these duties and the obligations arising therefrom. So the actual determination of the boundaries of the spheres of influence are for each of church and state institutions. The body of the legislation itself is simple. The constitution of the Church in all matters spiritual is as set forth in these articles, and in all questions of construction, says the Act, the declaratory articles shall prevail. So, on the face of it, much greater freedom of action for the Church than it had previously enjoyed, and the basis for the union between the Church of Scotland and the United Free in 1929. But what are the limits to that? And part 3 I've called the Percy case. Again, galloping forward through time, in 1991, Helen Percy was ordained as a minister of the Church of Scotland. In 1994, she was appointed as associate minister to a parish in Angus. In 1997, allegations of an affair between Ms. Percy and a married elder in the congregation came to light. Ms. Percy was suspended pending a disciplinary investigation. Various other steps followed. Ultimately, she demitted status and made a claim of sex discrimination based on the proposition that male members of the clergy, in relation to whom similar allegations were made, were treated more leniently than she had been. The Church won the claim at the Industrial Tribunal, now an Employment Tribunal, at the Employment Appeal Tribunal, and in the First Division of the Court of Session. That was the point at which I became procurator to the church. And of course, things went downhill as soon as that happened. The case was, I started as procurator in the spring of 2005, and the case was set down for appeal in the House of Lords in the autumn of 2005. There were two key points in the argument. Firstly, since claims of sex discrimination are only open to those who work under contract, did Ms. Percy fall into that category? Secondly, the effect on the claim of the 1921 Act. The second is obviously much more relevant to tonight's discussion. In short, the issue in the House of Lords became about the boundary between the civil and spiritual spheres. The judges were unpersuaded by the 1921 Act's exclusive jurisdiction, and the church lost 4 judges to 1. Matters were expressed by the judges in the majority in various ways, but typical are the following remarks. First of all, Lord Nichols, who said, and this is from paragraph 40 of his judgment, the expression matters spiritual is not defined, but on any ordinary understanding, if the church authorities enter into a contract with one of the ministers, the exercise of statutory rights attached to the contract would not be regarded as a spiritual matter. Sex discrimination claim would not be regarded as a spiritual matter, even though it's based on the way the church authorities are alleged to have exercised their disciplinary jurisdiction. Lord Hope, to similar effect, recognising in part that there was an overlap, if you will, between the claim of sex discrimination and discipline, which is one of the quartet of the 4 matters in the 4th article declaratory. He went on to say that, in his opinion, the provision of a remedy for unlawful discrimination is a civil matter, not a spiritual one. So the exercise of the exclusive jurisdiction of the church in spiritual matters does not extend to a claim by persons employed by the respondents that they've been unlawfully discriminated against, and Lady Hale to the same effect. The processes whereby they, that's church authorities, make decisions about membership and office may be subject to the ordinary laws of the land, will all depend upon what that law says and means. Surprising indeed if Parliament, enacting a law in 1975, that's the Sex Discrimination Act, in defined areas of activity capable of encompassing employment for the purposes of an organised religion, contemplated that alone of all such organised religions, the Church of Scotland should be immune. I offer my own observation that, in fact, comments that the expression matter spiritual is not defined, contradicted, and Lord Hoffman, who was the one judge who didn't go with the majority, Lord Hoffman observed during the argument, although he didn't put it in his speech, that the expression matters spiritual is actually defined. It's what's in Article 4. It's matters of doctrine, worship, government, and discipline in the church. And that this issue, the question of whether or not there had been sex discrimination, is as much a question of discipline as it is a question of sex discrimination. So there is an issue of characterization at the heart of this.
Laura, do you think you could wind up and we can pick up some of these themes in question and answer?
Yes, certainly. I have, I'm at the end of my remarks, and I have 5 conclusions, one of which is that the interpretation of the concepts of doctrine, worship, government, and discipline appears in fact now to be quite narrow. Secondly, that characterization is done by the state, in the Percy case by the civil court. Thirdly, that the right of a congregation to call its own minister is a deeply cherished right in the Church of Scotland. Fourthly, that issues of discrimination, sexual orientation, sex, age, and marital status, in my experience, are fundamental to the boundary question. And fifthly, that employment and discrimination issues needs a footnote in relation to whether ministers do or don't work under contract, and there is further case law on that, but not something we can explore tonight. Finally, a picture of some tectonic plates, given that in the case, in the Supreme Court case in 2013 of Preston against the Methodist Conference, or sometimes referred to as Moore against the Methodist Conference, Lord Justice Morris Kay referred to Percy as a case in which the tectonic plates moved. Thought you might like to see some tectonic plates, and we can perhaps come back to look at whether and if so, how far they have indeed moved. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for the tectonic plates. And now we move to our third speaker, Malcolm Brown. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you very much indeed. It's, I think, quite impossible to discuss questions of church and state in the English context without the great elephant of establishment dominating the room. So I'm going to talk direct to the elephant and try to do it in 15 minutes. Back in 2015, the National Theatre revived an early 20th century play by Harley Granville Barker entitled Waste. It's a play about the clash between personal and political ethics and morals, but the political part of the plot turns on a disestablishment bill. And I was asked by the director to meet with the cast and crew and give them essentially a working seminar on what was establishment, what was disestablishment, and why did it matter in the early 20th century, and what might be the significance of it now, which was immense fun. And I was then asked if I would write a program note to explain those questions to an essentially secular theatre-going audience in less than 500 words. Now, that in turn was a considerable discipline. And when I turned it out the other day, I actually thought it was better now than when I wrote it, when it felt so compressed as to be uncomfortable. So here we go, 500 words on establishment. 300 years after Jesus, the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official faith of the Roman Empire, and the church started learning what it meant to be powerful rather than persecuted. That power built a world where sacred and secular were one. Human labor was an offering to God. Monasteries were centers of learning, medicine, and culture. In every community, people built places of public worship, from humble parish churches to mighty cathedrals. This was Christendom, out of the Roman Empire by the New Testament. And if the reality was less rosy, it nonetheless became a potent image of an ordered society. But as modern nation states emerged, princes no longer felt inclined to bow before popes. The rise of nations, more than Anne Boleyn's attractions, explains Henry VIII's welding together of church, state, and monarch in a newly defined, established relationship. And revulsion against the ensuing religious warfare helps to explain the Church of England's commitment to the common good, expressed in nation and community, its breadth of sympathies, and its unresolved tensions. The modern state is a place of diversity and difference. By the 20th century, Roman Catholics and nonconformists were prominent in public life. Other faith communities were becoming more visible. The Church of England still sought to serve the whole nation, not least through the schools and social care it had pioneered, but to be fully English no longer entailed being Anglican, and an established church had to negotiate tensions between an explicitly Christian worldview and seeking the good of all. In 1920, delayed by the war, Parliament disestablished the Welsh Church, spurring ambitions to end establishment in England too. But Welsh Christianity had been reinvigorated by chapel revivals, and Anglicanism in Wales represented alien authority. As with devolution today, what worked for Wales and Scotland was harder to translate into an English context. The 1945 welfare state absorbed much of the church's social programme without appropriating its assets or taking on its responsibilities, like the upkeep of thousands of iconic buildings. State and church remained partners, but on a new footing. The established church continued to anoint the monarch. Bishops remained in the House of Lords, where they had sat since Parliament began. England still saw itself then as a Christian country, but plurality in religion and belief increasingly characterized society. Asked his opinion of Christianity, Clement Attlee replied, "Believe in the ethics, can't believe the mumbo jumbo." disestablishment sought a religionless ethics, mobilizing fellowship, altruism, and self-sacrifice, while jettisoning God and transcendence. But could disestablishment deliver? As contemporary philosophers like Alistair MacIntyre argue, ethics are meaningless without tradition, narrative, and community. England is an old country with many illogical traditions evolved from history and compromise. If ethics needs tradition, perhaps the capacious, tentative, and communitarian Anglican tradition is as good as any for uncertain times. Yet secularists still dream of a rational society, privatizing religion for those who like that sort of thing, and some church people who see tawdry politics corrupting pure religion still wish the church had never heard of Constantine. Disestablishmentarians fought to reframe the narrative about being English. Who would we be now had they pulled it off? So that appeared in the programme for the National Theatre, and I got no feedback from that whatsoever. But I was asked tonight to address the question, really, why establishment might be said to work for England when it patently not only doesn't work, but doesn't feel to be necessary for Wales, Scotland, or Ireland. To which I make two observations to start with. Wales, Scotland, and Ireland are distinct nations with distinct religious histories, quite distinct from England, and partly their secular and religious identities, as Gethin pointed out rather eloquently, has been framed partly by not being English. Secondly, it's been observed recently in a slightly different context that in a state made up of several nations, nationalism can work for good as long as it doesn't become the creed of the largest nation. When the largest nation takes to nationalism, the consequences are felt by all. I've no doubt whatsoever that disestablished churches work fine in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. But if England disestablished too, I fear the fallout would hit all churches and all nations, just as the onset of English nationalism is hitting us all. The tide of secularization, and here I suggest we're not just looking at the procedural secularism that Gethin referred to, but the programmatic secularization that the first edition, as it were, of the Welsh Parliament tried to impose. That's using a distinction introduced by Rowan Williams. The tide of secularization would sweep all before it. Religion would be popularly understood to have been vanquished from public life, which is a very different thing indeed from being marginalized. Now, none of that would really matter if establishment had no practical or theological foundation. But I believe it can actually give a reasonable account of itself on both counts, although it would take a great deal longer than I've got to work that through in any really convincing way. Pragmatically, the argument that having one established church is unfair to everybody else is, I think, challenged at the least by the fact that the leaders of many other faith communities say that they prefer to live in a state with an established church than in an avowedly secular state. The alternatives we have are not between establishment versus religious pluralism in relation to the state, but establishment versus procedural, programmatic secularization. The idea that the only form of political validity is some modestly statistical form of representativeness strikes me as no more really than the liberal outworking of Margaret Thatcher's dictum that all associations were by definition self-interested conspiracies against everyone else, and that only the ballot box was the source of authority that could be recognized by the state. Now, theologically, cutting many complex arguments rather short, I have argued elsewhere in an edition of the Ecclesiastical Law Journal a couple of years ago that the English model of establishment represents a theological model of authority conferred by powerlessness, which takes quite a bit of unpacking, I fear. But if you look at it this way, the Lords have traditional authority, but much less power than the Commons. The monarch has great authority, but much less power than Parliament. The monarch becomes the monarch when anointed by the church, something that, of course, people are beginning to focus on quite intently. And the church represents the God who appears to us in the form of a man on a cross, the ultimate powerlessness. There's a kind of two-way gradient here, power going in one direction and authority in the other, authority conferred theologically through powerlessness, but interaction. Establishment's one way of committing the of communicating the truth that authority and power are very different things and operate on these two opposite gradients. It is in effect a way of cementing the cross at the center of our image of ourselves as a nation. Now, of course, we're a long way from that being a popular perception, and you don't have to agree with the theology, I think, to suggest that actually there is something in this, that the embeddedness of Christianity within our perception of ourselves as nations can take one form, which includes the way in which the Christian faith is embodied on behalf of all within the English settlement of known as establishment. Now, it's only one argument. It certainly doesn't work everywhere. As with all theologies, there are other ways of doing theology that point in different directions. It doesn't contradict the fact that disestablished churches may well work better in different contexts. So I want to suggest that pragmatically, we should hang on to establishment, as it were, as Hilaire Belloc for fear of finding something worse, because the alternatives may not be the plurality that we seek, that actually establishment has some functional value in terms of the way in which it keeps religion in general at the heart of our consciousness as a nation, and that it has some theological warrant in the perverse gospel imperative that the crucifixion is the source and the manifestation of much of God's power. Like many English institutions, it makes no sense. It certainly makes no sense in a rational post-Enlightenment context. I take some comfort from the splendid line in John Milbank's work that postmodernity gives us a one-off opportunity to take what he calls a half-turn back to pre-modernity, and that it may just be in the postmodern consciousness that we have now that we might be able to rediscover some of that pre-modern understanding of religion and the state as it emerged in the very earliest days of modernity, that could be part of our salvation as an increasingly vociferous, conflicted and angry culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Thank you. Can I, just before we turn to our fourth speaker, ask you if you have questions and you've been provoked by very interesting presentations to put your questions in the chat. Others have done so, so you don't be embarrassed. And now it gives me a great pleasure to call on Johnny Clark. Johnny, over to you, please.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, just as I was about to get on there, my internet disappeared and I was a bit worried that I was going to lose you all. So I was going to move to a different part of the house, but I think I'll stay here where I am. So I hope this lasts 15 minutes. So thank you. It's great to have this opportunity to speak. I suppose my reflections maybe not as well. I mean, I just think the reflections we've heard so far have been brilliant, well thought through. Mine may differ in style a little bit. I also realized as I was beginning to speak, I always need to give an explanation for my slightly transatlantic accent. I'm a New Zealander by birth, and my parents moved here to Northern Ireland in 1984. So I've lived the vast majority of my life in Northern Ireland, but I still have this kind of funny accent. So that's in case you're trying to figure that out. Okay, so my reflections on church and state. as I sit here in Northern Ireland. Maybe I'll also just show you out of my front window, if you can see, that is Carlingford Lough on the Irish border. I look out over Carlingford Lough to the Republic of Ireland while I sit in South Down in Northern Ireland. And so I'm very aware of borders and states and disagreement over where states begin and end. In 1969, a period of deep, profound violence and societal strife was ignited in Northern Ireland. This violent and indeed tragic episode in our history has become known as the Troubles. It is the backdrop of Northern Ireland's history that will form part of the basis of my reflections today. I don't desire to prescribe exact responses to this question, but compelling factors to consider when evaluating how churches should relate to the question of power and the state. In this talk, I will make assertions which some would contest, but which I nevertheless stand over as warning signs for us. Essentially, I will be asking if there is an alternative to a mute church that has remarkably little to say to our societies, or indeed an alternative to a church that seeks political power to achieve its means. Are we silent or violent? What is the third way option for the church in 2021? This is a society that is increasingly post-Christian, that continues to be marked by deep sectarian divisions and polarization, and a society that is becoming more and more multicultural. In 1969, our society was divided. The British state was seen by half of our population as an oppressive presence. And this half of the population did not see themselves as British, but as Irish. So a state church was problematic in and of itself for this population. Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, in his book, The Dignity of Difference, said that following the Enlightenment, it was believed the church would become mute, marginal, and mild. Rather, he said, it is clear that religion is like fire. It warms, but it also burns, and we are the guardians of the flame. That phrase, guardians of the flame, became the name of a documentary and podcast series I've produced, looking at voices of those who embody a Christianity not of institutional power, but of vital love. This is a topic that does, I think, allude to the question of power in society. When studying modern history at Queen's University in Belfast in the early 90s, I learned of the contrast between the anarchists and communists at the start of the 20th century in Europe. The communists, I was told by my lecturer, had no concept of original sin. Rather, they sought a society when organized on the appropriate way would become a form of utopia. The anarchists, conversely, believed in a form of original sin. They believed wherever two people were together, a power struggle would eventuate. Power for the anarchists was the original sin of humanity. Therefore, the utopia they sought was created by the removal of positions of power in society. I'm not here to convert you to anarchism, but I do believe there is a compelling beauty in a community of people organized primarily around the axis of self-emptying love. This kenotic power, beautiful, needed kingdom strategy at a time of unprecedented polarization and at a time of remarkable indifference to the claims of Christianity. Maybe we should envisage a church separate from state and its allure of power, and instead a church confident that its power is most clearly seen and felt when it serves and loves. I'll make a couple of points here. Firstly, the church as a fertile space of active love. One critique of the landscape of Irish Christianity in the Northern Ireland of 1969 is that churches were on one end or the other of the spectrum. On the end of this spectrum, religion was employed as a willing tool in the hands of those who were behind the sectarian agendas of one side or the other. The other end of the spectrum was where religion was merely a docile presence, offering no radical alternative to the violence and extremism happening on the streets. In 1969, Northern Ireland had one of the largest populations of evangelical Christians per capita in Europe. Churches of all shapes and sizes were filled to the brim, and the church was seen as a vital part of society. The critique is that churches were either irrelevant in their passivity or dangerous in their sectarianism. What was perhaps lacking was a proliferation of churches as staging posts of resistance to the indifference, apathy, fear, and despair that permeated our increasingly traumatized society. I believe that we must learn to sing the Lord's song while in a strange land. The landscape we are faced with in the UK and Ireland today is increasingly multicultural and post-Christian in its nature. Among many ills in our society, I'll mention two. The difference between the wealthiest and the least increases inexorably, and polarization is becoming increasingly pervasive. In 1969, the obvious need in Northern Ireland was for church to respond to the violence erupting like a malignant cancer. The church has surely had to follow the Jesus manifesto of the Sermon on the Mount. It was needed for Christians to be a nonviolent, forgiving, prayerful alternative to the nationalistic sectarian violence we were seeing on the streets. The docile response by many churches could be said to reflect quietism more than the politics of the Sermon on the Mount. A friend of mine once said to me, there has to be something wrong with the church whose response to a bombing on a Saturday is simply the line, "Give peace in our time, O Lord." Shane Claiborne wrote these words, "Peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice, the act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer, the act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice." I might add that the answer to sectarian violence is neither the option of state by the church, nor is it the resistance to the state by the church. Rather, we must indeed find a third way that ultimately presents Jesus as the one who changes our society, not by top-down power, but through the power of non-coercive love. Second point is about the church as a big tent, or indeed a big river, big enough for many streams of living water within the Christian tradition. In 1974, in the darkest days of the Troubles, Reverend Cecil Kerr left his position as the Church of Ireland chaplain at Queen's University, found a derelict mansion on the Irish border, and called it the Rostrevor Christian Renewal Centre. He found a way to buy this derelict mansion and turned it into a centre for reconciliation. This was exactly the active third way thinking that we needed. Protestants and Catholics found a home in this new place. Indeed, many described the sensation of feeling like they were walking on holy ground when they entered the center. Why, I wonder, did it feel so holy? Maybe along with scenery that C.S. Lewis has said reminded him of Narnia, there was a more captivating reason. When Christianity breaks out of the narrow confines of one denominational label, it is free to more accurately resemble the image of its founder. Maybe when a church is attached to a label, a set of dogma, or indeed a state, it is less free to be the loving force it was intended to be. In 2010, my ragtag organization was gifted with Cecil Kerr's Centre. We renamed it An Cuan, which is the Irish word for a harbor. We purposed to not focus so much on creating a launchy pad for a takeover of our towns and villages, but to create a warm heart for our town and village, a warm heart that is big enough for all, including all of those who wouldn't darken the doors of a church. Indeed, maybe love is a verb, not a set of doctrines or legislative entanglements. Third point, the church showing power coming through love. Seduction to power is dangerous. Brian Zond, American pastor, echoed Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination, in a recent tweet. He said, Moses was radical. His vision of a society formed in the worship of Yahweh and the justice that flowed from that worship was revolutionary. Solomon was the anti-Moses. Solomon recreated Egypt and Jerusalem, complete with Egyptian temples, a standing army, and Hebrew slave labor. Imperial Christianity, he says, has always been far more enthralled by King Solomon than by Moses or Jesus. The church should be an active multicultural presence in our society. Alignment of the state with one branch of the universal church must surely create problems in our minds with this arrangement. During the Troubles, it became clear that no one church could represent a diverse population. The church should be made up of people coming from across the societal divide. And as long as the state represented by one body, then another part of the population will have antipathy towards it. For many active Christians in Northern Ireland, both Protestant and Catholic, there has been a desire to legislate for citizens what is perceived as morally righteous legislation. The big culture war issues seen affecting the churches in America have been played out here in Northern Ireland as well. Up until recently, abortion, for example, and same-sex marriage were not legal in Northern Ireland, unlike other parts of the UK. Those in churches determined to keep this legal status quo were eager for the British government not to interfere with this arrangement. Our internal instability, however, created a situation where the British government did make a ruling, allowing these two pillars of the culture war to become legal. Many Christians have strong views on same-sex marriage and on abortion. However, regardless of the rightness or wrongness of these opinions, what may be more important to consider is whether the motivation for their opinions are love. It is one thing to seek to enlist the state to legislate our political priorities, as long as we acknowledge that one cannot legislate love, and to love is the greatest commandment. We therefore often have a Christianity seeking power without love. In that instance, it becomes irrelevant. Whether their political instincts are right or wrong, the disposition of the heart has become corrupted by the will to power. I'll skip on a little bit here. I'm sure all of you know, familiar with Mennonite theology, that, places the church as a colony of the kingdom of heaven on earth, unencumbered by allegiance to the whims of whatever political group is in power. And maybe I'll just move to my conclusion because time may be running away from me. In conclusion, I believe Northern Ireland is a cautionary tale of how a divided society will always need a church that is not the possession of one side. Rather, the church should be big enough to pull in the different strands in a society that often threaten to tear it apart. Further, Northern Ireland shows us the ubiquitous temptation to assert one's ethnic identity through the power of government. We must surely resist that. We must remember our great commandment to love. When Jesus was asked who is the neighbor we must love, he named one of the greatest enemies of the Jewish people, the Samaritan. Churches must resist the allure of power as a means to deal with the nationalistic resentment of other people groups. Rather, the church embodies love. Finally, Northern Ireland possibly shows us that living for the kingdom of God does not mean passivity or quietism, but activism lived out in love and humility. One of the spaces I have found myself in recently in my Christian vocation as a peacemaker is as the facilitator for a group of Irish political elders. These are people who no longer hold political office, but who retain influence among their constituencies. It includes a former Irish Prime Minister, a former Northern Irish First Minister, and some of the most well-known names in Irish politics over the last 30 years. It is not a secret group, but our meetings are private. As I meet with this group, and I was with them just yesterday, I'm struck both by their failures, both personal and political. I'm also struck by the freedom, the creativity, and energy they bring to the question of how to build Irish peace when they are unencumbered by a political position or portfolio. Possibly in the same way the church can be at its most creative, liberating, and energetic when it becomes the eldership for a society, not the rulers of the society. Grandparents love and seek compromise and agreement. This kind of eldership is what our society needs from Christians. Non-coercive, loving, energetic, boundary-crossing sojourners walking in the steps of the Spirit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johnny. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. Before we turn to questions, someone has asked whether texts will be available. We are hoping that they will be. Certainly everyone will be able to access the recording of this webinar. The texts will, as they come in, will be provided through the Society and will be on, and Johnny has just emailed, or not emailed, in the chat you will see, yes, his text will be coming forward. So can we start with a question which comes from James Cassidy, and perhaps Gethin, I could invite you first to respond to the question. James Cassidy asks, I wonder if it is only the churches that are interested in church and state questions. There is little interest in Boris's newfound Catholicism except his marriage. There are no comments on the early 2020s when the Speaker of the Commons was a Catholic, the leader of the opposition was a Catholic, and the Prime Minister was married to a Catholic. I, that is James, speaks as a Scouser, whose native city was the location of interreligious riots for most of the last century. Do people see us relevant to the government?
Thank you, James, for the question. I mean, I'm glad to say that here in Wales, church-state relations are not all about conflict. We're not just relevant to the state when we're in conflict with each other. I hope we're very much relevant to the state when we're not. Indeed, the Society for Ecumenical Studies, our whole aim, of course, is precisely to reduce the conflict and not to become irrelevant in the process. Here in Wales, I work as policy officer for Churches Together in Wales, as was mentioned at the beginning. And my biggest problem is fending off all the departments of Welsh Government who view us as relevant, who want to know what we think and indeed what we're going to do about this, that, and the next social problem. They point out to us that even in our decline as churches together, when we add together our membership, there is no organisation with anything approaching the level of membership or the level of geographical coverage. Here in Wales, the level of linguistic coverage, both English and Welsh, and of course many other languages too. We reach into the vast majority of communities. If you extend it to faith-state relations, and when they talk to the Interfaith Council for Wales, then we reach into every single community without exception. Yes, we are very relevant, and the Welsh Government, we don't always agree with them about everything. We may come back to some of those later, I don't know. But yes, government itself, including people who themselves espouse no religious belief, very much regard us as relevant. And they regard us as relevant partly because we are symbols of reconciliation through difference and not of conflict. And so they don't come to us to solve conflict. They come to us because they reckon we're people who are able to live through conflict and still work together, as the picture you saw of the vigil on the steps of the Senedd illustrates.
Johnny, I wondered whether you would want to reflect, given the question and given your context.
Yes, do people see us as relevant to government? I think in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland I grew up in, grew up in kind of state schools, which are kind of largely Protestant. We said the Lord's Prayer every day, prayed. It was quite religious, but I viewed a society that was becoming more and more perplexed, indifferent, and hostile to Christianity. And largely that was because there was possibly a correct perception that religion was part of why we were having a conflict in this country. And so more and more people over here actually want nothing to do with religion. They see it as simply the source of problems. But I think when religion offers something beautiful, it suddenly makes the front page headlines. I think of when a young girl was shot dead by dissident Republicans in the city of Derry, Lara McKee. It kind of brought the whole population, galvanized the whole population. We couldn't imagine a return to the violence that we had seen during the Troubles. And there was a church service in memory of Lara McKee at St. Anne's Cathedral, and a Catholic priest, Reverend Martin McGill, spoke. He's a friend of mine. And at one point, he challenged the political leaders at the time who were in a standoff. And so our assembly was disabled. And he challenged them about their inaction and the need for them to show leadership. And everyone in the cathedral stood to their feet and started applauding while there was this difficult situation of the political leaders in question sitting there, and then also standing to applaud his statement. And that made the front pages of news. It made the news headlines, not because he was an angry person, but because he was prophetically speaking words that were challenging our political leaders to become agents of peace and reconciliation. I think of the Amish in Pennsylvania who forgave the killer. When Christians exert love, we become people can't take our eyes off us. But when we become dormant and seen as just dogma distillers, I think we lose influence, and people actually become hostile to what we have to say. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Malcolm, I just wonder whether that, what Johnny has just said, tallies with your reflections on power and authority and the church's powerless, the cross at the centre of our nation, etc. And whether you'd want to make any reflection there.
Yes, I echo what Johnny says, but in an English context, as you'd expect. And I think they're the same points. First of all, churches and religious groups, faith communities, are respected for the difference they make on the ground. When in the dog days of the Gordon Brown administration, we were approached by a number of rising conservatives who said, if we get into power, we want to approach interfaith relations differently. And we need a faith org because we don't believe you can do interfaith from a position of neutrality. We're looking for a faith community that's got resources in all the places where we want to work. Would you be up for it if we found some money? And that became the Near Neighbours programme that's now run since 2010-11 through the Church of England, but on behalf of all. I think it's changing. I think one difference is that some churches are increasingly behaving more like pressure groups. And the pressure group vocabulary plays for me rather too closely to the culture war vocabulary. Whereas we used to say, I'm right, so and you're wrong, let's argue. The tone is now, I'm right, so you're bad. And in culture wars, it's, I'm right, so you're mad. And I think more and more I hear from church groups that in the way that sounds, we're right, you're just bad. And I don't think that gets us anywhere at all. I think one of the things that we are able to do as the Church of England because of our position, including in Parliament, is to understand in love, to pick up Johnny's expression, that politics and government is blowing difficult. And the best politicians, which is most of them, agonize considerably and go through some torment about what they can and can't do and the compromises they have to make. And journeying with them in that is, in my view, an act of love. But to many of our fellow Christians, indeed, it looks like wishy-washy compromise, which of course the Anglican Church is always accused of. For me, it's precisely what John is talking about, but in a very English context. I would say, though, that in the present administration, churches have fewer friends than we ever had before.
On that cheering note, let's turn to another question. There's a question from Trevor Howard. He asks, should the churches or the church collude with the state when the state laws seem to prevent the normal worshipping life of the church, for example, in a global pandemic? And what does this mean for the desire to speak truth to power, believe in the divine protection of the saints, and standing up for religious rights and rights, that's rights, R-I-G-H-T-S,
Yeah.
and rights, R-I-T-E-S, of expression free from state control? Laura, could I invite you to reflect on that?
I think it's probably relevant to mention that a group of clergy succeeded in a judicial review of the Scottish Government's COVID rules, actually, earlier this year. So the predicate of the question, some church leaders in Scotland didn't collude with the state. You know, they actually took the state on and brought a judicial review of the restrictions on worship and were successful. Meanwhile, the Church of Scotland, as the Church of Scotland, had taken part in the series of regular meetings with the Scottish Government to monitor the effect of COVID and the restrictions which were required in relation to worship. So I suppose the judicial review was I don't want to use a derogatory term, I don't mean a rogue action, it was sort of unexpected action from a heterogeneous collection of clergy rather than the mainstream Church of Scotland. It wasn't officially participated in. So I think it's very difficult to say either way what the churches should or shouldn't do. I mean, I think individuals must do what they consider right. The Church of Scotland had taken a line and was meeting regularly with the Scottish Government and trying to secure influence from within. And the others who participated in the judicial review, perhaps you could say because they weren't part of that, I don't know, but they decided to mount this challenge and they were successful. The Scottish Government did in fact change the rules fairly shortly after the result in that case, whether post hoc or not. So I think it's impossible to give a general answer to that. I mean, yes, sometimes I think it is justified to take action. And of course, slightly undermining what I was saying earlier about the the boundaries between church and state. You know, the taking of action would nowadays be something like a petition for judicial review in the civil courts.
May I add a little to
Yes,
that
please do.
response? Because I was very much at the centre of the response early in the pandemic. And the Church of England, at any rate, made its internal regulations on the basis of its theological reflection, not on the basis of obeying government. And they were the principles of solidarity. If other people couldn't access the things they loved and cherished, why should we fight for that right? Because we should be alongside those suffering. It was on the principle of the common good. This is not about individual rights. We had to say that this to a lot of clergy who said, if I want to live sacrificially, that's my business. This isn't about you, brother. This is about the risk you may pose to all sorts of other people. And it was on the grounds that you don't actually break the law of the land on something that is also trying to seek the common good when you have no data that contradicts anything. We didn't then know the extent of the risk of communal worship. The data just wasn't there. It could have been a great deal worse than we thought it was. When we discovered it was less, we then argued and won the case for restoring access to churches. But it was done on the basis of theology, the theology of solidarity, the theology of the common good.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. In a sense, that takes us very neatly into a question from Elizabeth Welsh, the issues of solidarity. And Elizabeth asks as follows: how far is the church's role in relation to the state diminished by the separation between churches and the way a variety of Christian voices can be heard rather than a united Christian voice? I think we've got time for a brief answer from each one of you. So I think, Gethin, you've been silent for the longest in this session because I came to very first. Can we start with you, in which case?
In Wales, because the balance of the denominations is such that there is no one dominant, I mean numerically dominant denomination, and that's the same applies across faith groups. It's clear that the government cannot possibly talk to each significant faith group directly all the time about every issue, or even all the time about COVID, for example. At the moment, in fairness to the government, that would chew up their resources in a most ridiculous way. And so we've had to work ecumenically and indeed interfaith, but let's stick to the churches for now. We've had to work ecumenically, but as I said in the presentation earlier, of course, we'd chosen to do that back in 1999. That was a decision by the majority of Christian churches that equally none of us individually, not even the church in Wales, which is the biggest denomination numerically, could actually afford financially or in terms of staff or expertise to appoint someone who would then be full-time working in the new assembly. We had to do it together, and that's been appreciated on both sides. And I think one of the things we've been able to do over 20 years, but perhaps particularly over the past 15 months during the pandemic, is that we've been able to support the government with practical help and information, about different religious rights, to go back to Trevor's question, RITES. What is it we're wanting to do in church that involves physical contact? Are there ways we could do it without? What is really vital, what isn't, and so on. But also simply offering, during those same meetings, pastoral support. And I agreed strongly with Malcolm, not acting as a pressure group, but acting as people who are working together with government, not because we don't reserve the right ultimately, as happened in Scotland, possibly to disagree fundamentally, but where we don't disagree, that we also reserve the right to bring the voice of God into collaborative conversations. We do seem to talk an awful lot tonight about conflict, and actually I believe the Holy Spirit is at work in collaboration between churches and between church and government. And that is what we've experienced in the past 15 months in Wales in actually a very powerful way. And I believe that that's been a movement of God.
Thank you very much. Johnny, can I come to you? A disunited voice disadvantages society more widely?
I think that our separation between churches diminishes our witness, would be the thing I primarily see. In terms of our influence in a society, there's no doubt that greater collaboration is beneficial in every way. And I think it's a greater collaboration means that we're putting into practice the prayer of Jesus in John 17, that we would be one as he and the Father are one, that the world would know we're his disciples. So I think our witness is greatly affected by disunity, by separation. Our role in a society is affected when we're kind of separate. But I think there can be a beauty in separation as long as we do it in love. And I think part of the problem in many societies, not just over here, is that we separate ourselves and then we declare that we pretty much have the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And that becomes dangerous to our witness, and it means that our voice in society becomes more ignorable, I'm sad to say.
Thank you. Laura, if you were addressing us as the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, what would you say?
Well, first of all, I think I'd quote one of my colleagues at the bar who talks about the need to celebrate difference and manage differences. I think is quite a useful soundbite, and not really as a counter to what Johnny said, because I don't disagree with him, but perhaps the flip side of that is that I think it is inherent in the notion of diversity that listening to a range of different voices on a topic strengthens the decision-making process.
Thank you very much. Malcolm.
Well, working for the Church of England, it sometimes feels like I work for several conflicted churches already. So it's
you speak with experience, therefore.
It's a question of scale, I suppose. I think that there is a modernist heresy that nothing is true unless it's spoken unequivocally. I think truth, God's truth, is always bigger than we can grasp as human beings. That's to do with our frailty. It's to do with living in the theological interim between Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit comes among us and sheds God's grace, and the Parousia, when the kingdom will be finally revealed to us. We live in that interim. The early church thought it would be quite short. We've discovered that in our time, it's quite long, and we have to get used to it. And so we will always be looking at provisionality in our knowledge of God. And insofar as politics and the state are dealing with God's creation, that I believe applies to their deliberations too, and the better politicians understand it. There will always be rhetoric about the division of the church, which can be used to minimalize and marginalize us. But actually, in terms of dealing with truth, then with the proviso Johnny raises, it's how you say it. We're doing a lot of work in the Church of England on sexuality, which is not about forcing agreement, but by saying, do you express it with respect and love for people you disagree with? I think that brings us closer to the mind of God than knowing we're right and being sure of it.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all four of our speakers, not only for their very helpful and interesting presentations, but also the wisdom which they've shared with us in the Q&A. Thank you to Gethin, to Laura, to Johnny, and to Malcolm. Thank you very much indeed. And perhaps I could just end our webinar by leading us in prayer. A God by whose power alone humanity is enabled to live together, look upon the broken body of humanity. And grant that wherever people meet in council for the ordering of the world, thy Holy Spirit may bring them into unity and lead them in the ways of peace and justice through our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Amen. Once again, thank you very much to those who've posted questions. A huge thank you, and to everyone who's been with us this evening. Thank you very much, and good night. Thank you.